Welcome back. Thank you for being here. You have years of leadership experience in the legislative branch in Jeff City. So does your opponent. What sets you apart in that regard?
You know, one of the real strengths that I've had to develop as the Democratic leader in the State House is figuring out how to get things done without always getting the credit. A big piece of that is working across the aisle in an often very divisive environment. And as folks know, it's not even Democrats versus Republicans anymore. We now see the Conservative caucus, the Republican caucus, the Democratic caucus. And it's just been very interesting over the last few years, that further division. And so a big piece of my role as the leader has been, where can we work across the aisle to get things done, find places to compromise and be productive, and I feel like that's a strength that I bring to the table. What's
one of the items that you are proud of in that regard?
Yeah, we've done a lot of work in the foster care space and child welfare space with folks across the aisle, and some of the legislation that I personally have filed we've been able to get done, and so that's a place for personal passion.
Yeah, objectively, there's been a ton of good luck in Jeff City. That's just the name of the game. We've covered that quite a bit. If you become governor, that gets dialed up a notch to 11. So how would you try to work across the aisle with what could potentially still be a supermajority House and Senate?
Yeah, I would say that it could get turned up, but also could the same if Lieutenant Governor Kehoe wins. And I say that because they had such a contentious primary on the Republican side, and a lot of folks who actively worked against him are still going to be elected officials in the legislature. And so I'm not sure that, either one of us really brings that elevated up a notch or not. But I think really, for me, it's about being the adult in the room and bringing us back to the things that matter to Missourians. And as my role as the minority leader in the legislature, that has been a big piece of what I've done, going into the room with folks from both sides of the divided line within the Republican Party and finding that place where we can all work together and move Missouri forward, and we'll continue with that.
In that vein, what's the number one issue you think facing Missouri right now?
I think that functioning government is definitely the biggest thing that, as governor, I will put forward in terms of focusing on. There's a lot from crime to Missourians struggling to make ends meet. We need to look at jobs. We need to look at the education structure. But there's so much happening in Jefferson City where the state government is failing, and that's things like paying our bills on time for child care providers, making sure that Missourians don't have to wait on hold for 5 or 6 hours when they're trying to get services from state government. And that's a thing that I can do outside of party lines. That's a thing that we can get done on day one as governor.
Not necessarily problems within the General Assembly, but within the other branches, or within the executive branch.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Would you support tax cuts in any way as governor?
I definitely want to have a conversation around taxes in a more fair way. And I say that we have seen tax cuts in Jefferson City over the last 8 years that I've been there. Folks have touted the largest tax cuts in Missouri's history, but those have been for the corporations and the wealthiest in our state. And I know Missourians are still currently struggling within the tax system that we have right now. I want to look at tax alleviation around things like grocery taxes, or having conversations around tax credits for early child care or elder care, where we know so many Missourians are struggling having to take care of their aging parents, and that is not a space that Missouri has put much focus on. And so when it comes to tax cuts in the state of Missouri, I really want to have a conversation around what's fair.
Your opponent supports an income tax cut in Missouri. What say you?
Again, I think that this is a conversation that I'm definitely open to, and I want to see what proposals the legislature puts forward. But when I hear conversations around these tax cuts, I look back of what we've seen in Jefferson City over the last several years with the administration that he's been a part of. Again, we are seeing tax cuts for the wealthiest and not the regular working class folks.
You mentioned the financial strain, and inflation is cooling, but you still go to the grocery store and everything is way too expensive. Yeah. How do you as governor work to alleviate that?
Yeah, so again, I think having a conversation around the grocery tax is huge. When we look at Kansas next door, they got rid of grocery taxes, and that has been a direct impact to folks every single day. We're not talking thousands of dollars, but if you can save up to $1,000 a year as a working parent, that's a huge deal when you're going to the grocery store for your families. So that's a space that I want to look at. And again, issues around childcare I think are a huge one right now. Not only do we have a huge vacuum of accessibility, the affordability is a huge piece that is impacting so many folks across the state.
You mentioned jobs. How do you spur economic development and growth in Missouri?
Yeah, I am a huge supporter of public education and, of course, higher education as well. But I think it's high time that we understand not every Missourian needs a four-year degree, particularly when we're talking about job growth and attracting businesses and getting folks here. What can we do as a state to partner with our labor unions and our businesses on the ground and ask what type of trained workforce do you need? And then I would love to see investments from the state in those spaces, whether that's with partnership with our community colleges or those businesses on the ground training through certification programs.
Are there any sectors that you really want to champion as governor?
You know, obviously construction and the trades is a huge one right now. We are seeing an influx of money from the federal government through the Inflation Reduction Act, and we know that that money's going out. And so we need to provide that trained workforce to be able to make sure that those jobs stay in Missouri and we're not contracting with businesses out of state, bringing them in. We need to keep that money here locally for our small businesses.
Let's talk about reproductive rights, and this is a huge part of this campaign and in Missouri in general, because we have an amendment that would reverse the state's abortion ban on the ballot in November. Court battles are over for now, but opponents have said to expect some if this passes in November. What would you do as governor to protect the will of the people if this does pass?
I would say this is probably the biggest difference between Lieutenant Governor Kehoe and myself is his not support for Amendment 3. You know, he's actively said that he would tank his own campaign for governor to make sure that this amendment fails. While I have been a huge supporter of getting politicians out of our doctors' offices. And as governor, you know, as you mentioned, we're already hearing from folks on the other side of this issue that they're going to do everything they can to undermine the will of voters, just like they did with Medicaid, just like they've done with all of these initiatives that citizens put forward. And so as governor, I will veto anything that comes across my desk that encroaches on what the voters decide this November when it comes to reproductive health care. And not only that, we're going to do everything we can to support our doctors to increase the amount of medical professionals we're seeing in our state. I had a conversation just this morning from a doctor over at BJC in St. Louis who is supposed to be doing cancer research. But now what that individual doctor is doing is coming in and helping OBs decide when a woman is actively miscarrying, whether or not they can intervene and save her life. How far close to death is she? And that's what this doctor is doing, because we don't have enough OBs who are able to work in this field right now. Folks are fleeing the state of Missouri, and that's a fact. And so as governor, I will do everything I can to support our healthcare professionals.
You say you protect the will of the people. Conversely, if Amendment 3 fails, what do you do?
You know, I am a staunch believer in reproductive rights and healthcare, and citizens know that. I have always been in that vein, and so it will be working with the legislative body to see what we can do to support folks right now in the state. You know, as you mentioned, we have the most drastic ban in the country without exceptions for rape and incest. I want to have conversations around, if the voters turn this down, can we add those exceptions in within the legislative body? What can we do to support our doctors so that they are able to intervene and save the life of women? Does
having Amendment 3 on the ballot, you think, help you and other Democrats in November? How does that play out in your eyes, do you think?
I think it does, absolutely. You know, the Democratic Party has been very vocal in this conversation, but it's not specifically to the Democrats, of course. But, you know, having been one of the lawmakers in Jefferson City in 2019 when this bill passed, and that set us on this track to where we are today, you know, I shared my own personal story of abuse and what this bill would do to someone like me if it had been passed when I was a kid. You know, we had colleagues of mine talk about their miscarriages on the floor and how dangerous this would be for women like them. And so absolutely, we know that it's going to help with election turnout. We know folks are excited about this, and that crosses party lines. We know that more folks are going to show up to the polls. My job as the gubernatorial candidate is making sure that they understand that I'm the governor who will support them in that decision.
All right. And we know you've been crisscrossing the state on the campaign trail. Rural and suburban voters, of course, are essential to win the governor's race. How are you connecting with those voters in different walks of life?
Yeah, you know, I grew up in rural Southwest Missouri on a gravel road in the middle of nowhere, and so I definitely understand the importance of showing up in those spaces and having conversations with people. You know, I won my first election in 2016 with my yard signs right next to Donald Trump yard signs in the same yard as a pro-choice Democrat. And we did that because when you talk to folks about the issues that matter most to them, they cross party lines. We have the lowest paid teachers in the entire country and lowest funded education system. We have lost 18 in rural hospitals in the last decade, and that's a huge thing. People right now in the state of Missouri have to drive over an hour to get to some emergency rooms, and this is a life and death conversation. And so when I show up as a gubernatorial candidate, we talk about those issues that matter most and how I can help them.
Sure. Still, though, in this climate, I think it's safe to say it's so polarized right now, where even if you're not necessarily red versus blue, that's kind of where the peer pressure is to be on one side of the aisle or the other. How do you bridge that gap with just everyday people?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's showing up and talking to people. And again, there are so many issues that cross party lines. Even if the national level wants us to think that these are partisan fights, they're not. You know, rural Missouri education system is suffering. Oftentimes, the school district is sometimes the only employer in some of our communities. And whether or not we're funding our schools crosses party lines. And so again, to your point, you know, absolutely it is a struggle that folks are, you know, there's an expectation that you believe one way or the other when you're going into these different communities. And you could say the reverse for Republicans in the cities and what those conversations look like. For me, it's really about getting down to what matters most for Missourians. I'm going to be a governor that's going to listen to them and work with them to find solutions for our state, not continue the status quo of the gridlock that we've seen from this current administration.
Been a while since a Democrat had that job and was elected to that job. How do you hope to overcome that in November?
Yeah, well, to your point, you know, Amendment 3 we know is going to make a difference, of course, for turnout and folks who might be willing to cross the aisle in a time that they haven't been before. But you know, I'm no stranger to hard work, and as mentioned, growing up in rural Missouri, I definitely understand how important those voices are to the conversation. And so it's a both and. We've got to show up everywhere and make sure folks know who we are.
Krista Quade, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.